The war in Ukraine has already cost over 500,000 lives and nearly $2.5 trillion worldwide in destruction, aid, sanctions, and lost economic output. If it continues in the age of AI, there is a risk escalation no one can control or predict. This peace framework is not about justice, it is about survival, for Ukraine and for the world as our global risks multiply. World War III doesn't have to be nuclear, and we all need to pay attention. Russia has already basically won the war in Ukraine, and they have what they want, the Donbass. It is unlikely that any force on earth can do anything to change the fact that escalation will only bring mutual pain and worse outcomes for all, to say it lightly. Unfortunately, ceding land is the only way out, it is clear, and it will end the war. The cancel World War III peace plan for Ukraine is as follows. Territorial settlement. Ukraine would renounce claims to Crimea, Donetsk, Luhansk, and a narrow corridor through Melitopol, areas Russia has already integrated or demands. In binding exchange, Russia withdraws as a gesture of compromise from roughly 30% of the territory it currently occupies beyond Crimea, including the Zaporizhzhia nuclear plant and the east bank of Kherson. We have reason to believe Russia will take this deal. Security. Ukraine declares permanent armed neutrality, no NATO membership, but a strong modern defensive army and open integration with the European Union. In return, a UN-mandated international security guarantee force patrols a demilitarized frontier. Any attack on Ukraine becomes an attack on the world. Of the $300 billion in frozen Russian assets, half will go directly to rebuilding Ukraine, while the other half will be divided between phased returns to Russia and an escrow system that enforces compliance. This ensures Ukraine recovers from the war, while Russia only benefits if it keeps the peace. The result: Ukraine preserves 80–85% of its territory and nearly all its population centers. Russia gives up a third of its current battlefield gains for peace and normalization, and Europe gains stability in place of endless war. This is not a fair deal. It is a painful compromise, but it is the only path that can stop the killing, rebuild Ukraine, and prevent a wider catastrophe. We all need to understand the complex background of the invasion of Ukraine, which is the continuation of the 10-year war in the Donbass, sparked from an elected president being overthrown in 2014 for wanting to delay a trade deal with the EU he felt was unfair and didn't provide a direct enough path to join the EU. This led to street protests and the Maidan Revolution. The economic consequences of cutting off of trade from Eastern partners, including Russia, that would have occurred with the deal were real. Russia had offered the loan they were seeking and cheap gas. Some saw this as a bribe. The association agreement was a very expensive deal to take, and he asked the IMF and World Bank for a loan that they didn't get. The United States was already involved in Ukraine, and in addition to doing funding in an understandably unstable region, they became perhaps too involved when they chose the temporary government in a leaked phone call a month before the president was overthrown. The call became public and was undisputed as authentic. This complex situation led to many people in eastern Ukraine thinking their government was overthrown illegally and inquiring for an internationally monitored vote to cede from Ukraine, according to stipulations in the UN Charter regarding coups. Of course, this didn't happen because the new government felt the overthrow had been legitimate because the EU and US had basically legitimized it, as well as the Ukrainian government. And what commenced from there was a 10-year civil war in which the US funded one side and Russia the other. The bad blood grew, and historic rivalry and oppression of the Ukrainians added to the flame. This terrible war was finally brought to an agreement, giving the two regions, Donetsk and Luhansk, semi-autonomy. The terms were guaranteed by France and Germany in an agreement called Minsk II. Yet, the follow-through fell apart. Both sides blamed each other, but essentially the Ukrainians were worried that this would be a spoiler element for their national decisions. This is what set the stage for the invasion of Ukraine, not Russia randomly wanting to invade Europe. It had nothing to do with that. At that point, approximately the spring of 2021, Zelensky declared he would take back Crimea even by war, and did a global conference to garner support, Crimea Platform. The Russians felt that this would mean NATO would be placed in Crimea, their naval base for 300 years. They felt Crimea had not only voted to leave Ukraine in 1991, when Ukraine dissolved their parliament before it could come to a final vote, but that they had asked for a legitimate vote to be overseen when a legal president was overthrown and voted to join Russia in 2014. This is not to say they were right in taking Crimea, but you can see, and we should all understand, the complexity. Treaties of mutual security were sent by Russia to try to prevent the war, and they were not answered. Russia felt the placement of certain NATO weapons were unacceptable due to technical details of not being able to respond. Russia actually invaded Ukraine to force negotiations regarding the breakaway regions, where they felt their people were being oppressed from the building of tensions from the ongoing war in the Donbass and their legal status. There were many tensions, such as water wars and language laws, where Russian-speaking Ukrainians could be heavily fined for beginning a conversation in Russian without asking if they could switch languages to Russian in Ukrainian. These laws were on the book, but apparently not enforced. The strategy of finally invading to force negotiations seemed to have worked when in March of 2022, Prime Minister of Israel Bennett brokered peace talks in Turkey, where both sides basically came to terms and were close to solving the core issues. At that time, the US and UK, according to Bennett, encouraged Ukraine to withdraw from the talks, and the war continued as we know it today. I'm sharing this other perspective not to defend the invasion in any way. It is horrible, tragic, and needs to end. We also don't defend or condone Russian culture, but we need to understand that at this point we are all in danger from escalation, and it may not look the way we think. Literally, life as we know it could change in a negative spin if Ukraine does not cede territory and let the war be over, and let the rest of their territory be guarded by a non-NATO force, which Russia already said it would accept. The alternative is endless war, and the risk of a conflict that consumes us all. Choose wisely, for the continuation of the war in Ukraine may be the difference of us having a tolerable global reset that we all feel is coming, or one that is a living hell. The ceding of land is a necessary sacrifice, and we believe that Russia will withdraw from 30% of where they occupy now, if approached with this plan. They will not accept a ceasefire due to Minsk II, and will only accept final terms, legally binding agreements, and then a ceasefire. These are the realities. Thank you for your time.